Good afternoon, morning, still morning. Still Friday, whatever date it is. 30th, 11 o'clock in the morning. Here we are. Ways and Means Committee, we are taking some testimony from the Department of Taxes to follow up on questions that have come up throughout the year on tax compliance. And we have two folks from the tax department here. You all are welcome to join us in whatever configuration you would like. And I also just want to sort of, I'm sure that you all will say that, but just like let the committee know that when we're talking about things like compliance and enforcement, like probably there's some stuff that the tax department won't want to talk to us about for privacy, but also like in order to be able to do their jobs well. So I'll say that. You'll probably say it with better words. And Will, I don't know if you've met our new member representative Paige.
There.
Hi.
Will Baker, I'm the legal director at the tax department.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and I'll just add for the record, Rebecca Samrock, Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Tax.
So we are happy to answer any questions you have, but we don't have a prepared presentation today. We're not sure exactly what your questions are, but we're happy to answer any questions. I was aware you wanted to talk a little bit about the use of IRS data in compliance efforts and our interactions with the IRS these days as far as our compliance program. So I can start there.
Yeah, that's one, yeah, like sort of as the IRS removes staff, how is that a?
Sure. Sure. Yep. So we use IRS information and processes in a variety of ways. Probably the most kind of relevant this time of year is during the filing season. That's the current year filings. We participate in the IRS, it's called MEF, Modernized E-Filing System, in which taxpayers who file their personal income taxes electronically, whether it's like at home using software and they do it by themselves, or whether they go to a preparer, the preparer is actually filing them electronically. And so those all go up into the big computer in the sky and then go to the IRS. That's what literally happens. And then they move through the IRS to the states, and Vermont participates in that program. So that is a process that is going right this minute with the filing season. And that's going smoothly. They opened earlier this week. That was the official open. And we're off to the races with filing season this year. We're not aware of any challenges or anything new and different, particularly with respect to that this year. So that's kind of the current year stuff. And then as those returns come into the Vermont systems, we also use federal information for some screening processes where the return comes in, and we have what we call a fraud manager, which kind of looks at all the data really quickly as it's coming through and sorts through and scores what that might be a fraudulent return.
It's an automatic process.
It's an automated process, yeah. And baked into the fraud manager scoring is some federal information, both sort of past year general information about each taxpayer, but also in real time, if the IRS identifies what looks to be a suspicious filing, it'll put a red flag on that as it comes through to Vermont. So Vermont likewise gets the same red flag in the fraud manager. Or if another state identifies, this is not just with the IRS, but it's sharing among participating states. If other states see what they think is could be a suspicious return. They'll flag it, that'll go into the data set to the IRS, that'll come to us, and then we'll flag it as well. So that's in the current year, that's how we use that data. And even if a return is flagged like that, doesn't necessarily mean it's suspicious. It just means that it has a heightened review system at the department. So that's what it looks like in the current year. And then shifting over to our audit function, which is totally different and is really looking a few years back. The audit folks are always a few years back in time doing audits. So they have just completed runs of the 2022 filing season for a variety of audit programs. And we use federal data in those programs too. So the IRS sends us data sets for those years for a variety of things. We look at it for your basic non-filer. So that would be someone who has filed a return federally and has a Vermont address on their return, but we don't see a Vermont return. That's obvious. That's number one. That goes up. That goes onto a list that we work in an automated fashion. It could be where the federal return information doesn't match what the person filed on their Vermont return. Again, that goes on a different list for us to work. Then there's just federal, where our filings don't match federal data. Maybe they have two jobs and they remembered to report the income from one W-2, but not from their second job. And then the IRS has all that W-2 data. And so we would pick that up as well. And then discrepancies in that federal data versus the Vermont data, W-2 data. That would be another audit program. And then there's more, that's all like massive data sets that are coming in. And, we get hundreds of thousands of hits that may or may not be true audit problems. It could just be a problem with the data or something like that. But then the more one-off things are data sets of federal audits. So if the IRS does an audit, then it'll send us not all of the information, but the conclusion of that audit, how the person's federal adjusted gross income or federal taxable income was finally determined, and it'll send us that information. And if it doesn't match our information, we will wait to see if the person files a Vermont amended return after the federal audit, which they're required by law to do. If they don't, then we'll pick it up and assess that information as well. Everything that we see now has gone very well with the 2022 runs of that. We're going to do 2023 soon. Our compliance director did note that bucket of federal audits, that program, the data set for that program is down a little bit. She generally sees 400 to 500 of those a year for Vermont. And she's recently seen about 200. So that has been down a little bit.
Can I ask a quick question about that? Has it been trending down, or it was like, it's been 400 or 500 continually and then
I think it
plummeted?
was not trending down. I
Yeah,
think
thank you.
that's what she said. She reminded us that she saw something similar with another program, but then there was a supplement to that and it shifted back up. So she's not sure if that's like a final, if it's fair to conclude that is like a true final judgment of the work on behalf of the IRS for that year, or whether it's just we're midway through process there. So that's a high level summary of it all, and everything that I just said on the audit side, all those programs, we call them discrepancy programs usually, meaning there's some discrepancy between what we're seeing federally and what we've seen in Vermont, or lack of Vermont filing. All that together is, all those are automated processes that we do. In other words, a human doesn't necessarily get that federal data on a taxpayer by taxpayer basis, sharpen their pencil and figure a Vermont liability. It all happens in an automated fashion. And that's about $11 million a year of assessments. And so that's just one corner of our compliance division, and other areas of the compliance division do all kinds of other audits, but just not based on automated federal data.
Do you do you mentioned if a Vermont address is on someone's federal return, that's like one of the flags. Do you do any data matching with property tax records and income tax filings?
Yes, definitely for homestead issues and household income issues. Oh, I left that out.
Do you do it for income tax filing purposes?
Do we,
Do you check to see if it's possible that people are for income tax avoidance, do you check property tax records?
yes, when we're looking at a taxpayer and we're trying to figure out where they live, that's a whole nother audit exercise based on domicile. And an important factor there will, among others, will be, do they file homestead declarations in Vermont? Do they file property tax credits? That is like one of the first things we look at. I should have also said another use of that federal data is all that I mentioned, first household income for the property tax credits. So all that data coming in, it's not just reviewed for purposes of the Vermont personal income tax, but also household income flowing into the property tax credits.
So if there's an appeal process, and both the feds and you folks are involved, and we gave a couple of different examples, but is it one appeal process or is it separate? I mean, are they gonna appeal the feds and then appeal through you? How does that work?
It is separate. If you received a notice of assessment from the IRS and you don't like it, you would want to appeal that in the federal administrative process. And then if you get something based on that on the Vermont side, you would have to appeal that in Vermont. And often the federal action comes first. So you're going to be in that process when you get something from Vermont, and you would appeal that in Vermont. And what we often hear from taxpayers is, I'm working with the IRS on this. Can you just wait a little while until we get a final determination from the IRS? And so a lot of our appeals that have been sitting a while are sitting a while because we're waiting for a final decision on the federal side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Going back to the property tax question. So, do you have the ability to compare in data sets? Is it automated where you're comparing the income for somebody's personal tax return and the homestead declaration? You're saying that's the first thing you really check, but is there something that spits something out and saying, here's this person, this address, filing in Vermont for their income tax, and they live at this address, we know they own it, but they're not filing a homestead declaration? Is there anything that comes out and says, that's them? We should look at that, or?
It's generally on the taxpayer. The taxpayer has an obligation to file a homestead declaration or not.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily look at that for like on a individual taxpayer by taxpayer basis for like the tax rate. I don't believe if they filed for property tax credit, we would compare property tax household income data with personal income data. And really, that should have already happened when they filed their returns. Like whether it's a professional preparer or online software, that is a calculation that's made essentially based on the same inputs from the taxpayer. So I don't know why someone would file an income tax return with us and then skimp on their household income. That they would have to do that manually, I suppose, and we would identify that.
So there's a potential where the homestead rate is actually higher than the non-homestead rate for someone to say, why file the homestead declaration? I don't get a penalty if I don't, and I get a lower tax rate. So that's why There's probably 60 communities where that situation exists.
Yeah, so that's another process that we do, not so much related to like personal income tax auditing. But that there's a process by which we can evaluate and flip homestead treatment based on the information that we have, and then also based on information that we get from listers.
And then one more follow-up. I know of a few instances in which an LLC, the homeowner, will transfer the property to an LLC out of their personal names. And then it can be treated as a non-homestead as well. So it's another way to get around the compliance issue from that. I don't know if you're looking for that, or is that where it is, their personal income tax return is coming off that same address, but now it's the Woodman Page LLC that owns the property and not Woodman Page.
Yeah, homestead is a different issue and data field than the ownership of the property. For example, like technically speaking, a renter also has a homestead, and that's their apartment, and they don't own it. So like on the grand list, it's going to be the name of the landlord. Those are not one and the same things. So when we're looking at homestead, we tend to be looking at homestead for auditing for personal income for domicile issues, or looking at the property tax credit and or renter credit and whether that was appropriate with their household income. We're not so concerned about the name of the owner on the grant list. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's just a small loophole. I'm just not sure how many people are fitting through it.
In this example, that would be, someone would be trying to take advantage of a lower non-homestead rate.
Right.
And just, a reminder that, well, it certainly is happening across many jurisdictions, like those deltas are not the most meaningful, to a tax bill. I mean, if that's going to be your only motivation to do, create a business, its only purpose is to, rent a house back to yourself. I think, there's other instances of that type of, tax planning that are much more lucrative, I would think.
Can you talk a little bit about income tax responsibility, liability, and nexus for folks who are domiciled out of state but working remotely in Vermont? So you might not have, say, like payroll tax records on them or something.
And I'll just flag for the committee that I think under my name, we just shared a document that's kind of like a residency and apportionment 101 that I look at it a lot, honestly, just like a refresher of like how we treat income of folks who are, formerly residents, non-residents, and part-year residents.
Do you want to talk us that to start?
Yeah, is that helpful for folks?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Wait. Maybe I should have joined the Zoom after all. Oh, yeah, I have it up, and I can join if you'd like me to be sharing it up here.
We can look.
Okay, if you guys are okay looking on your own, then that's great too. Yeah, so just to set us up, this is a document that starts with some residency basics. Here. So first of all, just, articulating what's a resident, what's a non-resident, and what's a part-year resident. To be a resident, you qualify as a resident in Vermont for the part of the year where you're domiciled in Vermont. Domicile is a complex thing that Bill can get into the weeds of, but basically this is your permanent home. And also you have to maintain a permanent home in Vermont that you're present in for at least 183 days of the taxable year. And if you're a resident, an important thing to remember is all of your income is taxable in Vermont. And when we get into apportionment, we can get into how residents manage it if they're have some income that's taxed in other states too. But that's kind of the big takeaway there. A part-year resident basically meets the definition of a resident, but only for part of the year. So we think of that as someone who's moving in state or moving out of state. In that 1 year, you're a part-year resident. To be a non-resident, that means your domicile is elsewhere. You don't spend more than 183 days here in state. And if you're not a resident in Vermont, we only tax you on the income that you've earned here in Vermont. And we'll talk about how that's done in the next section of this document too. But yeah, you can think about this as a person who's, lives across the border, drives into Vermont every day for work, or someone who owns a business or a rental property here in Vermont, but lives in a neighboring state or somewhere far away. So then apportionment is how we scale someone's personal income tax liability based on whether they're a resident or a part-year resident or a non-resident. So in the case of residents, as we started off saying, all of your income is taxable in Vermont, but for any income in which you have, paid taxes to another state for that income, you owe another state because the income was made in another state, we allow a tax credit against your Vermont income tax liability for those taxes paid to another state. That's that other state tax credit, or OSCR, that we talk about. Sometimes come up in other miscellaneous tax bill discussions. And so this mechanism also applies if you're a part-year resident and you earn income in another state during the part of the year that you're a Vermont resident. That's a little less common than like the normal kind of part-year resident is like you would earn income in another state for that part of the year that you were there. And then, you might earn income in Vermont for the part of the year that you're here. But if those facts were flipped, then you're treated like a resident using that credit for income taxes paid to another state. But generally for part-year residents, when you earn income in another state during the part of the year that you're not a Vermont resident, you calculate an income adjustment percentage using our schedule IN 113, and that's where you calculate your Vermont income and then your everywhere else income, and you get a ratio. What slice of the pie was the Vermont slice? And that apportionment percentage is actually applied to your calculated tax liability. So your tax is kind of calculated as if all the income was Vermont income, and then you apply this apportionment percentage that reduces it to reflect the share that was actually Vermont income. And that's the same strategy that we use for non-residents, the same mechanism there. You calculate your income adjustment percentage and then apply that to your tax calculation.
There are exceptions to this. I think, or maybe they've changed, but for military personnel that are active duty, that are Vermont residents that are living elsewhere, their income is not taxed. Is that still correct?
I do know that that's a different situation. That's as deep as I can go. Yeah.
We have a military tax guide that's about 30 pages long for this reason. It is complicated, whether you're a Vermonter and you're called up to serve somewhere else, or whether you live somewhere else and you're called up and you're in Vermont, whether you're in Vermont but you're training somewhere else, or whether you live somewhere else and you're training in Vermont, and whether you're overseas. There's a whole bunch of different rules about that are, and what I mean is generally they're pretty favorable to the military personnel. Yeah.
So you come back to Vermont.
And also if you
Don't start.
live overseas, I'm not talking about military here, but just someone who does live overseas does keep their domicile in whatever state they were in when they left as well.
And so how aware are folks who are not domiciled here of their responsibility to pay Vermont taxes? And how do you find those people and make sure they're aware? And then if you want to talk about the battle between New York State and all the other states around it, that would also be helpful.
So are you talking about personal income
Personal
tax
tax.
mostly? Yeah. I would say, how aware are people? I would say there's different levels of severity. I would say let's start at the very minimal level. So this is someone who lives and works in another state, say in Massachusetts, and they come up to go on vacation in Vermont, or maybe they're with their parent, staying at their parents' house over Christmas, and they do a little bit of work on their laptop in Vermont. for, their Massachusetts job. And I'm sure we've all done this. We've all gone to other states and maybe did a little bit of work in that state for our Vermont job and our Vermonters. That is pretty de minimis, and that I'm sure that happens. Technically speaking, that would be Vermont income. And however, if it's a day or two, it's really not. I would say the awareness, if your question is how aware are people of their obligations, that would be like one end of the spectrum, like probably not very aware, probably not filing. And we don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about those. After all, it goes both ways, people coming to Vermont and then Vermonters going elsewhere. So that's one area. For employers, the people who are employing that person who is staying with their parents in Vermont over Christmas, we have a de minimis rule that if you're going to be in Vermont for 30 days or less, then you don't have to withhold for Vermont. However, if you're having an employee going to Vermont for a longer period of time, that's when we tell employers that they need to start withholding for Vermont because that's Vermont income. And I think the compliance on that is pretty good because withholding is really controlled by the employer and generally pretty tightly controlled by payroll companies, which is a very consolidated industry. And we work with the payroll companies all the time, and they are very careful about learning all the rules in all the states because they're trying to get it right. So I think the compliance on that is probably pretty good. If you really are having an employee come to Vermont for long periods of time, the employer is usually good about that. And then, of course, if you're withholding in Vermont, then Vermont is getting that tax, first of all. And if the employee thinks it's too much, then the onus is on them to file returns everywhere, where they live, where they work, and true that up at the end of the year. It's a zero sum usually for the employee because if they pay a little bit of tax to Vermont, then they'll get a credit for that on their income tax return wherever they do live, and it generally washes out more or less.
I feel like there's a middle ground between the home for Christmas and the working, like living here and working for a business somewhere else, which is like you spend 2 months at your summer house and a month in January at the house, and you're working that whole time.
Yeah.
And that like middle ground is, I think, the one that I'm most curious about.
Yeah, I imagine compliance is probably best for pretty organized things like a consultant being assigned to Vermont for a couple months and working here, a traveling nurse, someone working in construction and building a property in Vermont for months.
Yeah.
That's probably, the compliance on that is probably quite good. The person who has gone a little bit over a month, but not quite as organized assignment as far as their work goes.
Like a knowledge worker just hanging out.
Yeah, that's probably an area of compliance that is not as good. Again, we start to look at how much tax would that really be, and then for our compliance division, we would have to look at the return on an investment for undertaking audit programs that are specifically targeted to that
Okay.
fact pattern.
So you haven't tried to like look at property ownership and think about that before?
Property ownership, so like second homes and
Yeah.
and identifying how often they're there. Not so much for personal income tax purposes other than domicile,
Okay, thanks.
which absolutely we
Yes.
do. And that's
You covered that.
yeah, that's a criteria of many factors as far as whether you're a Vermonter versus Floridian or residing in another state. And that's a very complicated review. And that's a big chunk of our work, both audit work and legal work is domicile.
Yeah.
I have a question on real estate withholding tax. We talked about it, Jill Remick mentioned it, and she responded. I had some questions about that, about how much is withheld every year, and that's not really revenue to the state until they file their income tax, and then whatever's owed comes out of that and they get the refund. I'm just wondering, must be a very high compliance percentage for that because it's a lot of money. And I didn't know if you have an idea of that. I mean, it's like over 30 million a year, I think. And
I don't have a revenue it's view on that as far as revenue, but I do agree that the compliance is probably very high because it is baked into real estate transactions and undertaken by the real estate bar. And so that's just one of the, I mean, many of you have probably done a closing or many closings. It's a big stack of documents that your attorney or paralegal is working through. And one of them is going to be real estate withholding if relevant. And they have professional obligations to do that. And so, yeah, I imagine the compliance is very high. However, yeah, a lot of it is probably refunded back to the individuals. And I don't have information on how much we get in and then how much goes back out. I imagine it's probably quite high.
Go ahead.
I might be taking us down a different path though,
Okay,
about estate tax.
Okay, can we wait 1 second?
Yeah.
Oh, mine just totally went away. It's completely gone, so go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
We had a question come up yesterday about how estate tax works if people are living in two different places. So are living in Vermont for part of the year, living someplace else for part of the year, they pass away. How is that estate apportioned? How does that work with different states?
So in the tax world, you do not live in two different states, period. Like everyone has a domicile. And you only have one domicile. So that controls. And so for estate tax is assessed on and due from Vermont residents who pass away. So that's a Vermont resident, no matter where they happen to be when they pass away, or whether they own property in other states and whether they were there at the time that they passed away. If they're a Vermont resident, as far as domicile goes, and they meet the income that is taxable estate thresholds, they would be responsible for Vermont estate tax. And so that's period. If you're a Vermont resident, it's due to the state of Vermont. If you are a non-resident of Vermont, but you own property in Vermont, then again, and you are over 5 million of the taxable estate, then you could owe estate tax on your assets that are in Vermont. So for estate tax is due on taxable estates over 5 million. And if you're a Vermont resident, it's on the whole thing. If you're a non-resident of Vermont, it's calculated. So we look at your taxable estate everywhere. And then if you have property in Vermont, we assess estate tax on the value of that property, not on 5 million, because your 5 million are elsewhere. That's unconstitutional for us to tax that, but we assess estate tax on the assets that are here. And the tax is, we do look at the gross estate everywhere. And that is tricky as far as going back to compliance. That is tricky because if you, say you're a Nevada resident and you own a ski house in Vermont and you are over 5 million of taxable estate, 5 million taxable estate. Well, I use Nevada as an example, but I probably shouldn't because I have no clue what the estate tax situation is in, but let's assume there's no estate tax. So that person may not be aware that they don't care about a $5 million taxable estate. They've never planned for that. They've only planned for federal and Nevada estate planning, theories. So they may not be aware of that. And so for that reason, we do get some stragglers on the estate tax, because where that will come up for us is when they go to sell that property in Vermont. If it's a Vermont vacation home, when it comes time to sell that property, the buyer is going to be very careful on title and clearing up that title. And they need to know that the seller has the authority to sell it to their client. And in order to do that, you need to get a clearance from us and all that. So that's when we catch it, when that vacation property is sold in Vermont. Or it's not just vacation property. It could be an investment business or investment property or something like that in Vermont. Again, we would catch it when there's a transaction on that or financing on that. That's when we would catch it too.
So we just saw a chart yesterday about the aging of Vermont's population. I mean, is there a trend toward people sort of establishing residency? They still have their house, their primary house, not their primary house anymore, but their house in Vermont. But they're establishing residency in a lower taxation place for 184 days a year. And so all of their investment, assets, all of that other stuff that's kind of portable property essentially gets shifted to that other state as opposed to being taxed in Vermont as part of the state.
I wouldn't say there's a trend towards that. I would say that that's always been an issue, and not just for estate tax, but also for personal income tax for retirees, and frankly, weather.
Weather's a big part of it.
Yeah.
So I don't know that there's in our estate tax numbers, I don't know that there's a trend along those lines.
I remember are you done? Sorry. Okay. I remember my question. So I know that you all discovered sort of a loophole in the existing law with regarding property transfer tax that you noticed, asked us to close, right? That was amazing. Quick work. Loved it. How do you stay apprised of trends in legal tax loopholes? I learned about that one because someone sent me a random website link, which seems like not a system. But maybe that actually is a system. I have no idea.
Yeah, a variety of ways, ranging, it depends on the tax type, ranging from just professional development for our staff, conferences, collaboration with other states. The Federation of Tax Administration and the Multi-State Tax Commission and those entities do this kind of work all the time, identifying problems and issues that affect all states. Like domicile is an issue for every state. There's nothing unique about Vermont to it. And so they're always, communicating about these sorts of things. So that, conferences, all those sorts of things. More locally, just the buzz within the state from practitioners about all this, what they're seeing. And for example, the property transfer tax rate for second homes. We understood that was an issue when it passed, but also there's chatter all the time on the Vermont Bar Association real property section where all the lawyers are chatting about things all the time. Not in a nefarious way or a way to try to, gin up ideas for tax avoidance, but just.
I mean, to some degree, it's their legal job.
Yeah, they're just looking at a new law, and running through fact patterns in their head, well, what about this situation? What about that situation? So certainly that was an area of discussion there. So that's on a more local.
Thanks. We spent a decent amount of time sort of touching on trusts and then moving away from that conversation yesterday and a few other times. Might make sense to have a separate conversation about that, but I wonder if there's anything you want to just you would want to share to start that conversation.
Trust from the estate tax point of view?
Yeah. But also I think the income tax point of view as well sometimes.
So trusts are kind of people in terms of tax. So, conveying assets to a trust itself doesn't, that itself is not necessarily tax avoidance. The trust has to pay income tax every year on income generated from the trust, and then people receiving disbursements from the trust also are responsible for tax liability. So that itself is not really, it is what it is. There are rules for trusts that are very similar to personal income. In fact, most of the fiduciary and trust stuff is right there in the personal income tax law. For Vermont, as far as trusts go, some part of estate planning could be to convey assets to a trust as you're thinking about your estate plan. But again, there could be pros and cons for that on the tax side. I'm not a trust and estates attorney, although I play one in House Ways and Means. So you might ask some trust and estates attorneys as well, but generally speaking, you can put assets in a trust, and if you do it years before you pass away, there are circumstances in which it could be outside of the taxable estate for state and federal estate tax. However, you've put in motion a tax treatment for that has other consequences. The trust still pays income tax on that income within a trust, and then anyone who's receiving property from that trust, they are not getting a step up in basis that someone enjoys when they inherit something from someone who has passed away. So if my grandfather passes away and he gives me 100 shares of stock, the basis that I have for that, the starting point when I'm going to calculate my future capital gain, is the value of that on the date that he died. So that's good for me. I have a stepped up basis there, and I only pay tax on the capital gain that I experience when I own it. That is not the case if you put money in a trust. Generally speaking, that person, maybe your kid or your grandkid, who's going to have the benefit of that wealth from the trust, their basis is your basis. So you're handing over a huge potential liability to them. So there are tax consequences all around for all of this. And, it's a very case by case situation. In Vermont, for estate tax, we look back 2 years on any gifts that the decedent has made. And if they've made gifts within that 2 years, that's any gifts, including to a trust, that's pulled right back into the taxable estate. So you can't do it within 2 years in Vermont. There's a similar rule for federal estate and gift tax, and it is 3 years federally. It's only 2 years in Vermont. And I think the 2 years went in at the last round of really a review of estate tax several years ago. There is a look back of 2 years in Vermont for trusts for estate tax.
Anyone else?
I think you were gonna, you started to ask a question about the New York and the.
Oh, do you want to explain a little bit about the Great Battle of New York State?
Sure.
Not your personal battle. It's every conference I go to, like every tax professional talks about it.
Sure, and it's definitely a very hot topic, particularly in the Northeast region. Deputy Commissioner Samaroff mentioned that, try not to say Rebecca, mentioned that if you are a Vermont resident and you earn income elsewhere, generally you get an Oscar, another state tax credit for that tax you paid to another state. So that more or less it washes out for your Vermont tax liability, your overall tax liability. There could be some small differences in tax rates among states where it may not work out exactly right, but generally speaking, you're generally made whole because you're getting a credit from your Vermont tax for that income tax paid to other states. So Vermont loses out a little bit, but you pay tax in the other state. And same goes for the flip side if you're a Vermonter earning income and all the states that just sort of agreed to that. By the way, we only offer that if the other state offers a credit too. So that's the way it's worked, where like all the states who have income tax have just done this because they want the same for their residents. Anyway, however, state laws do differ among all the states. And so exactly what that means can be different in different states. And so the rules about sourcing might be slightly different in other states. This is huge on the corporate income side. You've heard a lot about that, where a corporation every year generally is not paying tax on exactly 100% of its income. It could be 80%, it could be 125%, because all the rules are different in all the states it's operating in. Same goes for personal income tax if you're like a multi-state taxpayer. the sourcing of that income might be different based on the state's rules. New York has the most aggressive rule about sourcing that I'm aware of. And their rule, it goes back many, many years, has to do with really the headquarters of your employer. So if I am live in the Bennington area, I'm driving across state every day into New York State and working there and driving home at night, we all agree that's New York income. You're going to pay tax to New York. We're going to give you a credit in Vermont for that tax paid to New York. It's all fine. However, if you say you ask that employer in Glens Falls, New York, do you mind if I work from home on Mondays and Fridays? Is that a big deal? They say, oh no, that your desk is here in New York State. This is your assigned work location, but you can work from home Monday and Friday. New York will consider that New York income because you, the employee, is asking for it. It's not something that the employer is doing that is assigning you a work location. And it's called the convenience of the employer rule in New York State. There's a long list of criteria about how they evaluate this, but they will generally consider that New York income. And a different situation would be if that Glens Falls, New York employer says, we want you to head up our Vermont field region, work from home in Vermont, cover this area in Vermont. That's absolutely, even New York would agree, that's Vermont income because the employer is saying to you, hey, go work at your home in Vermont. So that's the tricky part where the rules in Vermont and New York are slightly different. Vermont has a straight, very simple physical presence rule. If you're in the state of Vermont working, that's Vermont income, period. And so there are situations where people are at their home in Vermont. This affects Vermont residents, not non-residents. They're home in Vermont and they're working for a New York employer. We consider that Vermont income and New York considers that New York income. And a real unfortunate situation here is that if we were to accept that New York other state tax credit, Vermont is out that income tax, where our law suggests that that is Vermont income, not New York income. However, New York very much considers it New York income. States have really struggled with this over the years. This is not a new thing, particularly in like the New York metro area where a lot of people are coming from Connecticut, New Jersey into New York. New York has always enjoyed that ability to expand their rules about what is considered New York income to the maximum extent. Legal scholars say there is nothing wrong with this on a constitutional basis, that this is even people who hate this rule agree that it's probably constitutional. It's probably, there are some hardliners who think it's even unconstitutional, but many feel that this is just unfair. It's unworkable as we move into a era where people are working remotely for firms all over the world, that it just doesn't make sense. This rule doesn't make sense anymore. It's very much like the old sales tax brick and mortar rule, where you have to have a physical presence in the state to be responsible to collect sales tax. And that was the rule of the US Supreme Court for a long time. And then the internet happened and the court had to just throw that out because they're like, it's not the world we live in anymore. I think we're probably in that era right now where we're moving toward that being unworkable. But that is the situation right now. And so it's a huge, hotly contested issue. There are legal cases going right now challenging New York's treatment. But it is a headache, and the states in the region are at a real disadvantage because there's nothing we can do from a Vermont perspective to recover from this. So many more people live in Vermont and make big money in New York State than people who live in New York State and make big money in Vermont. So the power imbalance is just massive here. And so there's really nothing that a state can do to change this. States have tried. Connecticut, New Jersey have passed all kinds of laws saying, we'll give you reciprocal treatment, but only if you undo this. They're offering tax credits to people who go to New York and challenge their assessments in New York legally. They'll support you in your legal challenges in New York State, because that's where this needs to have, there's nothing you can do is suing in Vermont to solve this. You have to go to New York and challenge it there. And so they're trying all kinds of things right now, but really the answer ideally would be uniformity among the states, and that's not something that New York has been working toward.
Is there something like the way we have it, interstate sales tax compacts? Is there a move towards doing something like that with the income tax?
Many states already have a physical presence rule, so
Yeah.
we are uniform.
Okay.
It's just the,
Through
and
it.
by the way, I should say, it's not just New York. There's a couple other states that also have this rule. So I think we've already, as far as changing our law, like a uniform law initiative, like the streamlined sales tax, we're already there.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, really appreciate you just like coming in here to answer whatever random question we throw at you. Super nice, thanks. Sure, you've been looking forward to it all week. Is there anything you want to add before we close up?
Looking at your hype man. That was great, Will. Added a lot of substance to this conversation.
One more thing I just will say on the estate tax thing. If you are considering changes to the estate tax, I highly recommend hearing from trust and estate attorneys. This area is tricky because people make their estate plans when they make them. And if the law changes, it could be many years after they've made their estate plans, and they could be in various stages in their life and health. I'll just use my father as an example. We don't have to worry about the estate tax. I wish we had to worry about the estate tax, but he's nowhere near the 5 million threshold. But my dad has had dementia since 2017. He retired in 2004, and he's still very much alive and kicking. It's 2026. So someone in his position probably couldn't change their estate plan now unless they had a very strong POA, power of attorney, with someone that was watching out for them, because no attorney is going to change their estate plan for someone who's not of sound mind. And so we do have a POA for him, but if he didn't, there's no way that could be changed. So people make these plans, say you're 65, you retire, you solidify you tighten up your estate plan, and then time goes by and you get older, and you may not be paying attention to your finances as well anymore, and you may not have people around you who are paying attention, and your assets may have grown. You may not have had to worry about the estate tax if you were at 2 or 3 million, but if that was 20 years ago, maybe you do now. And so now I understand that this is a wealthy population.
I just want to I will speak firmly for the record right now for whoever is watching. I personally have absolutely no intentions to change the estate tax this year. It just came in really high, so everyone's talking about it. And so thought it would be helpful to learn about it.
Yeah, my point is, while it is a wealthy population, maybe not a sympathetic population, it is a tricky thing to
Yes.
change the estate tax. Also, just because if you change the law, everyone is going into the estate attorneys all at once, trying to make changes, and it's very difficult and overwhelming. So there's a tricky part of changing estate tax law that's a little bit different than your basic personal income tax changes. It's just it's kind of a different. The population is it's a different situation.
Really, that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, we're not taking any more testimony today. Encourage you to spend the afternoon looking at the regional assessment districts and the tax classification so that you can really bring your best thinking when we take those on next week. Actionable ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, your best Friday afternoon thinking. So I'll see everyone back on Zoom on Tuesday after all the things that happen on Tuesdays, 1 o'clock.